Carrie Severino are next, but first this. On Monday, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to strike down a Louisiana state law requiring abortion doctors to have admitting privileges at local hospitals. The court said the requirement posed substantial obstacles to a woman's access to abortion without significant benefits to ensure the safety of women. Here to discuss the fate of that Louisiana law is Vice President and Chief Counsel at the Bioethics Defense Fund, Dorinda Bordeley, as well as Chief Counsel for the Judicial Crisis Network, Carrie Severino. Ladies, thank you for being here. And I also want to get to some of the more recent Supreme Court cases as well. Dorinda, let's start with this Louisiana law, which you helped draft. It was struck down by the High Court. What was your reaction when you heard the reasoning of the court's decision here?
Well, Raymond, thank you for having me today. And of course, the reasoning of this decision is deeply troubling. And I look forward to getting into that a little bit with you. But I want to say this first. There is no case and there is no court that can put a stop to a movement that is so diverse and that is based on love. And that's what the pro-life movement is. And so I just want your watchers and listeners to know that the pro-life movement is alive and well. We will continue. We're so proud that a pro-life Democrat, a Black woman who knows that women's health is entitled to the same respect as anyone else's health, was our main spokesperson and author. We had a great Attorney General's office. And there were actually there's a sliver of hope and some gains in here that we can discuss as well as we move forward.
Okay. I want to talk about Chief Justice Robertss, who was the tie-breaking vote in this case. In 2016, in a similar case involving the state of Texas, the court ruled 5-3 in that case to strike down the Texas law. Robertss dissented with Justice Clarence Thomas in favor of upholding the law requiring abortion doctors to have admitting privileges at a local hospital. In this case, however, he voted with Justice Breyer to strike down the similar Louisiana law. What makes this more interesting is Robertss did not join Justice Breyer's opinion. He wrote his own instead, making it clear that he still disagrees with the Texas case, okay? He said, I joined the dissent in Whole Woman's Health and continue to believe that the case was wrongly decided. The question today, however, is not whether Whole Women's Health was right or wrong, but whether to adhere to it. The legal doctrine of stare decisis, according to precedent, requires us, absent special circumstances, to treat like cases alike. Carrie, does this make any sense to you? Is John Roberts trying to have it both ways?
Unfortunately, it seems that way. He agrees this law is not, in fact, unconstitutional, and yet strikes it down in an about-face. You know, there are a lot of opinions on stare decisis, but no justice thinks that every decision should be followed simply because it was decided by a prior court. There are factors that normally get balanced, and he lists some of those in his opinion, but he never bothered to really explain why they should apply in this case. It's a relatively recent decision. There hasn't been reliance on that decision that would say, oh, it's so well entrenched in the law, it would be disruptive to remove it now. What it seems like, unfortunately, is part of a pattern of Chief Justice Robertss, where he seems to, when he wants to make a decision that on legal grounds he acknowledges is correct, doesn't also want to face the political ramifications of having that decision. But unfortunately, making those political judgments isn't the judge's job. They should be calling balls and strikes, as Chief Justice Robertss said it himself.
Now, Dorinda, I suppose Justice Robertss would have let Plessy versus Ferguson stand since it was on the books for 58 years. I mean, it was a precedent, a badly reasoned and created precedent. It needs to be overturned. So Justice Breyer, who authored the court's decision on Monday, wrote that the Louisiana law was almost word for word identical to the Texas admitting privileges law that the court ruled against in 2016. If the cases were almost identical, why did the court take up the Louisiana case?
The court took up the case, and if Chief Justice Robertss was being intellectually honest, he could have said, look, what the court does is we protect precedent, we follow precedent as to what the test is, and then we apply the unique facts of each state to that test. And Louisiana had a very robust record, unlike Texas, showing that our abortion clinics were subject to all kinds of health and safety violations. They were cited for that. There were shoddy clinics. There were women who had complete hysterectomies because they didn't have IV fluids. And those facts should have been applied. And so what's so bizarre and frustrating is that if Chief Justice Roberts were a district court, a lower court, he could have said, well, I have to follow precedent even if I disagree with it. He's the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He admits in this opinion that the 2016 Texas ruling was wrongly decided. And then he says that he has to follow a wrongly decided opinion. And you're right. That would mean that Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, Korematsu, all of these unjust decisions would stand under that bizarre logic.
In his dissent, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote,
Transit.
Abortion precedents are grievously wrong and should be overturned. The idea that the framers of the 14th Amendment understood the Due Process Clause to protect a right to abortion is farcical, as the origins of this jurisprudence readily demonstrate the putative right to abortion is a creation that should be undone. But today's decision is wrong for a far simpler reason. The Constitution does not constrain the state's ability to regulate or even prohibit abortion. This court created the right to abortion based on an amorphous, unwritten right to privacy. Carrie, I'll start with you. Thomas was the only justice who wrote this and the only one who signed on to this dissent. What does that tell you?
Well, for a long time, Justice Thomas has been the only member of the court who's actually spoken directly saying he thinks that Roe and its progeny were wrongly decided. But I think it doesn't tell us exactly what the other justices would do. I think they're just saying, look, even if you don't have to go that far. There are so many other grounds. This is why another reason Chief Justice Roberts' opinion was so puzzling. There are so many other reasons. As Dorinda pointed out, it doesn't. You could even have applied the same standard they used the Texas law and apply it to Louisiana. Louisiana had a much stronger case. It should have been upheld. And as the other justices pointed out in their dissents, even applying prior abortion precedents, this law should have stood. On top of which, as Justice Thomas explained as well in his decision, this case shouldn't have even been in court, because what was happening is abortion clinics were suing on behalf of the women, saying, on behalf of the women, we want lower standards, lower medical standards. Right. That is something the courts almost never allow, and it's very strange. It's a kind of excuse that only happens in the abortion context, that they create this exception to the general rule that you can't allow a clinic to sue against the interests of its own clients and pretend to be suing on their behalf.
Mm-hmm. Dorinda, do you see the court accepting more abortion cases in the future? And has Roberts cast himself as the new Anthony Kennedy here?
Well, that's the interesting thing. And that's the sliver of light that I want to bring attention to. What people don't know is that after that what mostly people don't realize is that after that 2016 Texas decision, in which the court put forth a very confusing balancing test, it caused a lot of chaos in the courts. And moments after that came out, the abortion industry filed lawsuits in Louisiana and state after state, challenging at one time the entire body of pro-life law, ultrasound laws, laws about clinics being safe and having clean instruments. Every single law was challenged, and they were trying to strike down everything. And under a very broad interpretation of that Hellerstedt decision. And so the good news is that Chief Justice Roberts' concurring opinion did go to some pains to give a very narrow reading to that opinion and basically brought it back to the 1992 undue burden test, which has allowed the states to promote the interest of safety for women, to promote women choosing childbirth over abortion. And that is something that means that our pro-life laws can stand, and the pro-life movement can continue to be creative in moving forward with policies that help women choose life, giving them the